There's a kind of silence that arrives before anyone actually leaves. It doesn't live in the door that closes or in the words left unsaid. It lives in the space between the look and the turning away, between presence and premonition. It's the sound of something slowly coming undone while you're still holding on. And you already know this sound. You know it so well that you've started hearing it before it even exists. You've begun carrying the ending inside every beginning, like a secret no one else knows, but one you swear is written into everything. Every smile carries the shadow of a goodbye. Every closeness carries the weight of a future distance. And you stand there, in the middle, living two realities at once. The one that's happening and the one you're certain will happen. Because for you, every connection is also a countdown. It's not that you don't want to trust. It's not that you don't want to believe someone can stay. It's that something inside you learned, a long time ago, that people leave. And it wasn't a lesson taught with words. It was taught with absences, with doors that closed without explanation, with faces that disappeared without warning, with promises that turned to silence, and the body kept score. The mind recorded it all. And now, whenever someone gets close, there's a part of you already preparing for the moment when that person won't be there anymore. You don't choose to think this way. It's not a rational thought. It's a sensation that rises through your chest, that tightens your throat, that makes you review every gesture, every word, every pause in conversation, searching for signs. Signs that it's starting again, that you're about to be left behind. And the worst part is, you know that sometimes these signs don't even exist. Sometimes it's just the echo of what already happened repeating inside you. But even knowing this, you can't stop looking. There's a profound exhaustion in never being able to be fully present with someone because part of you is already saying goodbye. In never being able to completely relax because you're always monitoring, measuring the temperature of affection, trying to guess if the tone of voice has changed, if the frequency of messages has decreased, if the gaze is slightly more distant. You've become an expert at interpreting coldness where there might only be fatigue, at reading rejection where there might only be distraction. And this isn't overreacting, it's not neurosis, it's not making a fuss. It's a learned response. It's the result of being taught through experience that love is temporary. That presence is conditional. That you need to stay alert because if you're not, you'll be caught off guard again. And you promised yourself you'd never be caught off guard again. But here's the paradox that imprisons you. You need closeness, but you fear it. You want to be loved, but you don't trust love. You want someone to stay, but you act as if their departure is inevitable. And so you oscillate. Sometimes you move closer. Sometimes you pull away. Sometimes you ask for attention. Sometimes you disappear. Sometimes you open up. Sometimes you shut down. Because you don't know how to be near without feeling like you're putting yourself at risk. Don't know how to love without preparing your own exit. And this creates a strange and painful cycle. You test people. You push to see if they'll come back. You distance yourself to see if they'll follow. You create situations, consciously or unconsciously, to confirm what you already believe, that in the end, everyone leaves anyway. And when someone actually does leave, you feel two things simultaneously: the brutal pain of loss and the bitter relief of being right, because at least now you don't have to keep waiting anymore. The fall has already happened. This way of feeling didn't come from nowhere. It has an origin. It has a history. And this history isn't about blame. It's not about pointing fingers or reliving grievances. It's about understanding that at some point you needed to learn how to survive in an environment where affection was unstable, where the presence of people who mattered wasn't guaranteed, maybe because someone left, maybe because someone was physically present but emotionally absent, maybe because you were forgotten, neglected, or simply not seen. And when a child doesn't understand why they're being left, they don't blame the adult. They blame themselves. They conclude there must be something wrong with them, something that makes them difficult to love, difficult to keep around. And so they begin developing strategies, ways to protect themselves, ways to never feel that pain again. And one of these strategies is simple but devastating. Never fully trust that someone will stay. Always be prepared for departure. Always have one foot out the door, Because if you never completely believe someone will stay, then when that person leaves, the pain will be less. At least that's what you came to believe. And over time, this strategy stopped being just a defense mechanism. It became part of who you are. It shaped how you relate, how you present yourself to the world, how you choose people, how you behave when you're near them. You became someone who loves with reservations, who gives themselves but always holds something back, who is present but never completely unarmed. You learned to be functional in abandonment, to continue even when people leave, to not need anyone completely. And this gave you strength in a way. It gave you independence. It taught you to manage on your own. But it also isolated you, left you exhausted. Because living always on the defensive, always expecting the worst, always protecting yourself from what hasn't even happened yet, is exhausting. It's living in a constant state of alert. It's never being able to rest completely in anyone. It's carrying alone a weight that should never have been yours. And time, for you, works in a strange way. The past didn't stay behind, it's here now, infiltrated into every interaction, every new person who comes close. You don't live the present as it is. You live the present as if it were the repetition of something that already happened. As if every new relationship were just a different version of the same story. And the future isn't an open possibility. It's a dark certainty. You already know how it ends. You've already seen the ending before even reaching the middle. And this changes everything. It changes how you experience joy, changes how you receive affection. Because when someone tells you they love you, you don't just hear that. You also hear the echo of the day when that person will stop saying it. When someone is near, you don't just feel the presence. You also feel the absence that will come. And so you're never really here, never completely in the moment. You're always one step ahead, anticipating the pain, preparing the exit, rehearsing the goodbye. And this steals from you the one thing that could, perhaps, heal you. The full experience of being loved now. Not yesterday, not tomorrow, now. But you've developed sophisticated ways of dealing with this. Ways that on the surface seem to protect you, seem to keep you safe. You distance yourself before being abandoned. You end things before being ended. Or you do the opposite. You cling so tightly that you suffocate. Control, check, need constant reassurance, need proof that the person is still there, still wants you, will still stay. And both strategies work in a way. Both give you the illusion of control. If you leave first, you can't be left. If you cling too much, at least you're trying to prevent the departure. But the cost is high, because when you distance yourself, you lose the chance to discover if the person would have stayed. And when you cling too much, you transform love into prison, transform closeness into surveillance. And people feel this. They feel the weight of your distrust. They feel that no matter how much they do, it will never be enough to make you believe. And then, ironically, some do leave, not because they wanted to, but because it became too heavy. Because loving someone who's already expecting abandonment is like trying to fill a cup with a hole in it. No matter how much you pour, it never gets full. And you see this happen and think, see, I knew it, I always knew. But what you don't see is that sometimes it was the fear itself that created the prophecy. It was the defense that caused the loss. And there's something even more painful, something that's rarely said. The abandonment that hurts you most isn't from other people. It's your own. Because over the years, trying to protect yourself from being left, you've been leaving yourself. You've been learning not to trust your own feelings, to question your perceptions, to doubt what you feel. When someone tells you you're overreacting, you believe them. When someone tells you you're too intense, you shrink. You learn to silence the part of you that feels deeply, that needs security, that wants to be chosen, because you learned these needs are too much. They're inconvenient. They're the reason people leave. And so you began treating yourself the way the people who left you treated you, with impatience, with coldness, with the implicit message that you're too difficult to love. You internalize the rejection. And now, even when you're alone, you're not at peace with yourself. There's an internal voice repeating that you're not enough, that you need to be different, less needy, less sensitive, less you. And this internal abandonment, this divorce from yourself, is perhaps the deepest wound. Because you can survive people leaving. But how do you survive losing yourself? You look at all of this and part of you wants to change, wants to learn to trust, wants to believe it's possible to be loved in a stable way, wants to stop living with one foot out the door. But there's another part, just as strong, that fears this change, because this way of being, as painful as it is familiar. It's known. It's yours. You know how to function like this. You know how to protect yourself. You know how to survive. And letting go of this, allowing yourself to believe, allowing yourself to trust, would be like removing your armor in the middle of battle. It would be exposing yourself completely. It would be risking feeling again that pain you swore you'd never feel again. And so you remain trapped in this ambivalence, wanting closeness, but fearing vulnerability, wanting love but not believing in it, wanting to change but being afraid that if you change you'll get hurt even more. And this isn't weakness, it's not cowardice, it's just the internal logic of someone who learned, the hardest way, that to love is to risk losing. And that losing hurts more than anything else. And perhaps it's important to say this clearly. You're not wrong for feeling afraid. You're not wrong for having learned to protect yourself. You're not wrong for carrying this scar. What happened to you was real. The pain was real. The losses were real. And the child you were did the best they could to survive all of this. Developed these defenses because they had to. Because there was no other choice, and these defenses brought you here. Kept you alive. Kept you functioning. And that deserves to be acknowledged. Deserves to be honored. But it's also true that what saved you in the past might be imprisoning you in the present. That the protection you needed when you were vulnerable might be preventing you from living fully now. Not because you're weak, not because you don't try, but because the world changed and the strategy didn't. You grew, but the fear stayed the size it was when you were small, and now it occupies a disproportionate space. It screams louder than reality. It transforms possibilities into threats. It makes you read the present with the eyes of the past. And here's something that might change everything, not as a magic solution, but as a reframing. The problem isn't the fear. The fear is legitimate. The problem is living your entire life from the fear. It's letting it make all the decisions. It's allowing it to choose for you who you let in, how you love when you pull away. Fear isn't the enemy. The enemy is the life unlived because of it. And there's a subtle but crucial difference between having fear and being the fear. You can feel afraid of being abandoned and still choose to stay. Can feel afraid to trust and still choose to open up. Can feel afraid that someone will leave and still choose to be present while that person is here. The fear doesn't need to disappear for you to live differently. It can be there, whispering its dark predictions, and you can still choose not to let it drive. Can recognize the voice, thank it for trying to protect you, and still take a step in the opposite direction. This doesn't mean ignoring the fear. Doesn't mean pretending it doesn't exist or convincing yourself that everything is fine when it's not. It means something more subtle and more difficult. It means learning to be with the fear without being consumed by it. It means recognizing that it's present, understanding where it comes from, and still not letting it be the only voice in the room. Because the truth is, you'll never have guarantees. There will never be a promise that's unbreakable. There will never be a way to love that doesn't involve risk. And waiting for absolute certainty before allowing yourself to trust is waiting for something that doesn't exist. It's postponing life indefinitely. It's trading the possibility of real connection for the illusion of safety. And in the end, you don't become safer. You just become more alone. The path, if there is one, isn't about eliminating the fear or completely healing the wound. It's about learning to live with it in a different way. It's about choosing, consciously, in small moments, to act against the automatic impulse to protect yourself. It's about noticing when you're pulling away out of fear and asking yourself, is this real or is this the echo? It's about noticing when you're testing someone and choosing instead to simply say what you need. It's about allowing people to see the part of you that's afraid instead of hiding it behind indifference or control. Because vulnerability isn't weakness. Vulnerability is the only real bridge between two people. And yes, it's frightening. Yes, it puts you at risk. But it's also the only way to discover if someone can actually reach you. If you never show yourself, you'll never know if you'd be loved as you are. You'll only know if you can keep the mask in place. And this needs to be done slowly. It's not about throwing yourself all at once into blind trust. It's not about forcing yourself to believe something you don't believe. It's about small experiments. Small acts of courage, allowing someone to get a little closer, allowing yourself to feel a little more, risking saying a truth you'd normally keep to yourself, and then observing, seeing what happens, seeing if the sky falls, seeing if the person runs away. And most of the time, you'll discover they don't. That people are more capable of handling your truth than you imagined. That the intensity you think is too much is actually what makes you real. That the need you learn to hide is actually human. And this won't heal everything at once, won't erase years of conditioning, but it will create small cracks in the armor, small spaces where light can enter. And over time, these spaces grow. It also means learning to be present, really present, not with your mind in the future, anticipating the loss, not with your mind in the past, reliving the pain, but here now, in this moment when the person is still here, in this moment when you're still being loved, in this moment when nothing bad is happening. And this is harder than it sounds, because the mind trained in abandonment doesn't want to stay in the present. It wants to flee to the future, where it can prepare. It wants to return to the past, where it can confirm its beliefs. But the present is the only place where healing happens. It's the only place where you can experience something different. It's the only place where you can notice that in this exact moment you're not being abandoned. And if you can stay here, even for a few seconds, even for a few minutes, you begin accumulating experiences that contradict the old narrative. You begin building memory of permanence, memory that sometimes people stay. And these memories, however small, begin competing with the old ones, begin creating a new internal possibility. And part of this process also involves reconnecting with yourself, returning to trust in your perception, returning to respect your needs, returning to treat yourself with the kindness you've always offered others. Because if you continue abandoning yourself, if you continue silencing your needs, if you continue telling yourself you're too much, then it doesn't matter how many people stay. You'll still feel alone, because the most important person left, you. And reconnecting with yourself isn't selfishness, it's not narcissism, it's emotional survival, it's learning to be your own safe harbor. It's stopping waiting for someone outside to validate your existence. It's beginning to ask yourself, what do I need right now? What do I truly feel? What's mine and what's fear? And sometimes the answers will be confusing. Sometimes you won't know how to distinguish. But the act of asking, the act of turning inward with curiosity instead of judgment, is already a beginning. It's already a way of saying to yourself, you matter, your needs matter, your feelings are valid. And it's also important to learn to differentiate between people who leave because they weren't meant to stay and people who leave because you made it impossible for them to stay. Not every departure is about you. Not every loss is confirmation that you're unlovable. Sometimes people leave because they're dealing with their own wounds, because they're in a different moment, because the connection, however real it was, wasn't sustainable. And that hurts, but it doesn't mean you're defective. It just means not everything that begins needs to last forever to have been real. It means you can be loved deeply and still be left. And these two things don't cancel each other out. You were loved, and the person left. Both are true. And holding both truths at the same time, without trying to resolve the contradiction, is part of growing emotionally. It's part of becoming someone who can love in a more mature way, more realistic, more human. But it's also true that some people leave because the fear became too big, because the distrust poisoned the relationship, because you pushed so hard that eventually the person stopped coming back. And recognizing this isn't blaming yourself, isn't saying you're the problem. It's just acknowledging that the pattern has consequences, that the way you protect yourself has a cost, and that if you want something different, you'll need to risk doing something different. You'll need to risk lowering your guard, risk believing, risk staying, even without guarantees, even with fear, even knowing it might go wrong, because the alternative isn't safety, the alternative is loneliness. It's always living from a distance, always protected, always alone, and perhaps you've realized that's not a life. It's just a slow way of disappearing, and so you return to that silence, the one that arrived before anyone even left. But now, perhaps, you can recognize it for what it really is. Not a prediction, not a truth, but a pattern, an echo, a memory that repeats itself. And recognizing this doesn't make it disappear. but it changes the relationship you have with it. You can hear the silence and not automatically believe what it says, can feel the tightness in your chest and not immediately act from it, can notice you're preparing for a goodbye and choose instead to ask. Ask the person, "Are you leaving?" Ask yourself, "Is this real or is this fear?" And sometimes the answer will be painful. Sometimes the person really is pulling away, but sometimes not. Sometimes you'll discover the silence was just tiredness, that the distance was just a moment, that the goodbye you imagined was never happening. And in these moments you learn something crucial. Not every goodbye is real. Not every absence is abandonment. And you can survive the fear without letting it destroy what's still alive. This doesn't mean the fear becomes easy to live with. It doesn't mean you suddenly stop scanning for signs or stop feeling that familiar dread when someone's tone shifts slightly. It means you start catching yourself in the act. You start noticing the moment when you slip from present reality into future catastrophe. And in that noticing, there's a small window, a small space where you can make a different choice. Not always, not every time, but sometimes. And sometimes is enough to begin changing the trajectory. Sometimes is enough to start building evidence that contradicts what you've always believed. That you can be afraid and still be okay. That you can feel the fear of abandonment and still experience connection. That the two can coexist without one destroying the other. And there will be setbacks. There will be moments when the old pattern reasserts itself completely. When someone does something small and innocent, and your entire system goes into alarm. When you find yourself withdrawing without even meaning to, or clinging desperately, or testing in ways you promised yourself you wouldn't. And in these moments, the temptation will be to see it as failure, to believe you haven't changed at all, to conclude that you're broken beyond repair. But these moments aren't proof that nothing has changed. They're just proof that you're human, that healing isn't linear, that old patterns don't disappear just because you understand them. They fade gradually, unevenly, with many returns before they finally loosen their grip. And what matters isn't that you never slip back. What matters is what you do when you notice you have, whether you use it as evidence of hopelessness or as information, as a signal that you're scared, that something has triggered the old wound, and that you need to be gentle with yourself while also not letting the fear run the show. There's also something to be said about choosing differently, not just in how you respond to others, but in who you choose to let close in the first place. Because not everyone is capable of staying. Not everyone is emotionally available enough, consistent enough, aware enough to meet you in the place you're learning to inhabit. And part of your healing involves discernment. Learning to notice the difference between someone who is genuinely unreliable and someone who is simply human, between someone who is actually pulling away and someone who is just having their own moment of struggle, between a relationship that is genuinely unsafe and one that just feels unsafe because of your history. This kind of discernment doesn't come easily. It requires you to trust your perception again, something you learned not to do. But as you practice being more present, as you practice staying with what is rather than what you fear will be, this capacity grows. You start being able to see people more clearly, not through the lens of your wound, but as they actually are. And perhaps most importantly, you begin learning that your worth isn't determined by whether someone stays or leaves, that you can be entirely lovable and still be left, that someone's departure says more about their capacity, their timing, their journey, than it does about your value. This is one of the hardest truths to internalize when you've spent a lifetime believing that abandonment is a verdict on who you are. But it's also one of the most liberating, because once you truly grasp this, once it moves from your head to somewhere deeper, the fear loses some of its power. Not all of it, maybe not even most of it, but enough that you can breathe a little easier. Enough that you can let people in without immediately preparing for them to leave. Enough that you can experience closeness without constantly monitoring it for signs of decay. And in this gradual shift, something unexpected might happen. You might discover that the very thing you've been so afraid of, being truly seen, being fully known, is also what you've been longing for all along. That beneath the fear of abandonment is a deeper wish, to be met, to be recognized, to have someone look at you, really look, see all of it, the fear and the need and the intensity and the wounds, and choose to stay anyway. Not because they don't see these things, but because they see them and aren't frightened away. This kind of recognition doesn't fix the wound, doesn't erase the history, but it offers something the wound never had. Evidence that you are not too much, that your need for security isn't a flaw, that the part of you that was made to feel like a burden is actually the most human part of you. And when this happens, if it happens, it doesn't cure the fear of abandonment, but it makes it possible to live alongside it, to have the fear without being defined by it, to carry the history without being imprisoned by it. There's a certain kind of courage required for this that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It doesn't look like boldness or confidence or fearlessness. It looks quiet. It looks like showing up even when every instinct says to run. It looks like saying, "I'm scared you'll leave," instead of creating a test to see if the person will stay. It looks like staying present in moments of connection instead of immediately looking for the exit. It looks like treating yourself with compassion when the old pattern emerges instead of shame. This kind of courage doesn't announce itself, doesn't get recognized or celebrated, but it's the kind that actually changes things, the kind that slowly, imperceptibly rewrites the story you've been telling yourself about what's possible. And maybe that's what all of this comes down to, not fixing yourself. Not becoming someone who never fears abandonment. Not reaching some imagined destination where love feels safe and people never leave and your nervous system never goes into alarm. But learning to live more fully in the middle of it all. To have the fear and the hope at the same time. To risk connection while knowing it might end. To stay present even when the present is uncertain. To keep choosing in small ways to meet life as it is rather than as your history told you it would be. This doesn't make you invulnerable. It doesn't protect you from loss. But it does something more important. It lets you actually live, actually experience the moments of connection that are here right now, instead of spending them all preparing for when they won't be. You're here now, carrying all of this, carrying the fear, the history, the wound, the defense. And none of this will disappear just because you understand it. None of this will resolve just because you've read words that make sense. Change, if it comes, will come slowly, will come in small moments of choice, will come in small acts of courage, will come in small decisions to stay when everything in you wants to flee. And it will be difficult, it will be frightening, it will be exhausting, but it will also be the only way to discover that maybe, just maybe, you can be loved in a way that stays. Not because you became perfect, not because you stopped being afraid, but because you allowed yourself to be seen. And the person chose to stay, not despite who you are, but because of it. And when this happens, if it happens, you'll realize that the silence you always feared can finally be just silence. Not a goodbye, just the sound of two people breathing in the same space, together, for now, and for now is enough. But even if that particular moment never comes, even if the fear remains louder than you'd like and the pattern more persistent than you'd hoped, there's still something you can offer yourself. You can stop abandoning you, can stop treating your needs as shameful, can stop apologizing for feeling deeply, can start recognizing that the intensity you've tried to hide is actually what makes you capable of profound connection, that the sensitivity you've been told is weakness is actually a form of awareness, that the fear itself is just love with nowhere safe to land. And maybe that's where it begins, not with someone else staying, but with you staying, with you, for you, in all the messy, frightened, longing parts. That's not a solution. It's not a cure, but it is a beginning. And sometimes a beginning is all you need to realize that the story isn't over yet, that there are still pages left unwritten, that the silence you've been hearing might not be an ending at all, just a pause, a breath, a moment between what was and what might still be. And in that pause, there's space. Space to choose differently. Space to feel the fear without letting it decide everything. Space to stay even when staying feels impossible. Space to hope even when hope feels dangerous. Space to be exactly as you are without needing to be anything else. And maybe that space, however small, is where healing actually happens, not in the grand transformation, but in the quiet choice to remain, to stay present, to keep breathing. To let the silence be just silence, and the moment be just this moment and yourself be enough exactly as you are, fear and all.